you also say you wanted to explore the narrative of art in terms of things we leave behind, and how the emergence of certain technologies can complicate that narrative. I'm interested to hear you elaborate on that statement, about how that ties in with your ideas and feelings about the state of the Anthropocene, but also, how does the work complicate that narrative of what we leave behind?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that I've been interested in is like how we tend to see like the image as like a document. Like when the photograph first arrived on the scene, it changed the art world. Um, and because now like you've got things that can recreate life almost exactly as it is. Now that's getting a little complicated because you've got things like these exact programs that can generate images. You've got ways that you can transpose people's faces in videos onto other people's bodies. And there's so many tools now that throw into question the authenticity of the photo and the image that we're so used to. So I think thinking of that in terms of like things we leave behind and, sort of like creates this ambiguous state of things.
Yeah, it's as if we're into. I mean, in some ways, we're entering into the science fiction realm of not knowing. Getting into situations where sometimes we don't know what's real. I'm interested in how creating how in the process of you creating computer generated art, how that has challenged and changed the way you personally think about the act of creation itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way that the computer generates the art, and thinking about that in terms of how like people generate art. Obviously, like the way that the program is modeled is like made to model sort of the human brain in a sense, in that you show it thousands and thousands of images, and it kind of like adjusts its little parameters that you don't see. It learns basically, oh, okay, if I want to if I want to recognize this thing as art, it has like these qualities, and it kind of just like learns these things as it goes along and tries to make a guess at that when it tries to produce something. And it kind of makes me think like, do I do that? Like, am I just sort of like regurgitating all these things that I've picked up in these like weird parameters in my brain that have just adjusted based on the things that I've seen? So that's kind of an interesting way to think through like, how we as artists create things, and how everything that we've seen, all of our influences can like come into what we make.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting to compare, like the like a computer process to a human process, but it seems like that's very much what you're trying to do with this project in some ways. Exploring the dichotomy between those two things. Another question that I have is, you also talk about technology and how we create technology to suit our needs, right? So that's a continuation of this idea of, teaching a computer to think the way we think, or to mimic a process of the way our brain works, or something along those lines. But as we create technology to suit our needs, you say it also shapes our behavior and reveals things about our society and our desires. And my question for you is, what do you think this project reveals about society and our desires? And has the act of engaging in the process to make this work shaped your own behavior in new ways?
So I think this project in particular, so the data that I put into the program comes from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. They have a big database online. Um, and so I guess seeing the images that it puts out, um, it it learns based on those images that I input. So it's kind of like a reflection of the set that I trained it on. Um, and so in a sense, it's kind of like getting a feel for, what do we find valuable or beautiful, or particularly what does the Met collection find valuable. So
That's
that was
really
interesting.
important. That seems like a very important
Yeah.
thing to mention. Yeah.
Hmm. And so like a lot of the types that I'm including with the works are like kind of play off of that. Like, some of the objects in the Met collection come from like these very wealthy donors' collections. So like I've got an object called "From the Collection of No One," because like these images don't come from anyone. Um, it's kind of like one of the few guilt-free things that you might see in a museum because they're fake images. They came from no one at all. There's no culture that's being robbed, I guess.
I mean, that's an interesting comparison to make, uh, which I think brings us a little bit more into the fictionalized nature of what you're doing. But I'd also say it is really interesting to think about, using a database like the Metropolitan, like the database of the Metropolitan Museum of Art that we could associate it with, colonialism, and I mean, so many. We could associate it with a lot of negative things, but it's also a tremendously rich collection that references such a long history. And it does seem apropos to use something like that for this project, given the fact that you're exploring this idea of this very long human history. And I think in many ways, I feel like you're speculating about the future, really, in a way of the human race. And so it's interesting to use a collection like the Met that is, yes, rife with a lot of sort of socio-political connotations, to then make a piece called "From the Collection of No One." I mean, again, I think this gets back to uh, how you're dealing with contradictory forces, right? And it kind of draws it full circle. So I see you dealing with contradictory forces in terms of how you're working with different mediums, from computer science to plaster to 3D printing, but also through the materials you're using in terms of this database, but then also the direction you're taking the work in seems in many ways another contradiction. So can you speak to some of those a little bit more about the idea of contradiction as it's related to the database you use, but then also the direction you're moving in with the project?
Yeah. So one of the biggest draws for using that database in the first place is because it's so extensive. It covers such a long history, but it's so extensive because they procured so many objects from so many different places, and there's a lot of things to unpack about that. Um, and that's kind of like how I settled on the term Anthropocene, because it covers basically the length of what we consider human history. And some of that is up for dispute. Does it start back at the agricultural revolution, or does it start in the industrial revolution? And I see like using AI to generate these objects is a way to sort of bridge that whole history, and bring it into the modern era as well, because this is something that's only possible now. Um, so that was an interesting sort of like contradiction to work with, sort of the past and present, things that wouldn't have been possible back then, and sort of like taking all of these objects, throwing them into this black box, mixing them together, see what comes out. Um, and it's impossible to ignore the baggage that those images coming from the Met collection, how that factors in. And then in terms of, I guess, the whole process, you know, that I mentioned before how like it feels like an inverse of how most artists usually operate. It's almost like putting the cart before the horse, you know, the image coming first and then trying to recreate that. So that felt like an interesting sort of reversal.